Welcome back everyone. So this week we are doing common house plants. This is our second installment of Tuesday Tips with Maddie. That's kind of what we're thinking about calling it. Anyhow, I've brought out a bunch of our favorite house plants that are very forgiving, very easy to do. And we're kind of just going to go over a lot of the kind of rules of thumb for doing plants indoors, just some of the things to keep in mind, some of the things to think about when looking for the right plants for you to be successful with your indoor plants. So before I go over the beautiful things that I've pulled out on the table for you guys, we're just going to get into it with some of the different things to think about when you're choosing your indoor plants. So the biggest and most limiting factor when it comes to doing house plants is always going to be the amount of light that you have available. So when we're talking about light, sometimes you'll see on the plant care tags, or you'll hear people say bright light, indirect light. So we're kind of going to go over what that means because it's a little vague. So bright light is always going to be directly in the window, under a skylight, in, an atrium type thing, that kind of thing. But it's going to be either a west window or a south facing window. They're going to get more of that direct sunlight, and it's going to be considered bright light. Medium light is, I would say, one of the more common lighting situations, even when it is in a window. That's going to include your east-facing windows, windows that are west and south but are covered by your porch overhang or the big shade tree in your front yard, that kind of a thing. Light where it's across the room from a very bright window, somewhere you can comfortably read throughout the day, but not necessarily in the window. That's going to be your medium light. And most things are going to do well in medium light. Definitely all of the things I've pulled out today can take medium light. Low light is going to be either north-facing side of the house windows or the corner across the room from a window. Anything kind of below medium light is going to fall into that low light. And there definitely are different plant families that do well in low light and can tolerate it, but as always, you don't have to have something in low light just because it tolerates it. If you enjoy one of the plants that is marketed towards low light, you can always have it in a brighter light. It'll probably just need to be watered a little bit more. So don't ever worry that you have too much light. That's a good problem to have. Certainly if something's right in the window of a very bright window, west side of the house, it can burn sometimes, but it's not going to be something as common, not something you should really worry about. So aside from light conditions, once you've kind of got that figured out, you know what areas in your house you have available for plants to be in, you can kind of start thinking about watering schedules, how often you really want to water, how often you usually water. Do the house plants that you've brought home in the past, do they end up crashing really quickly, and when you go to throw them away, they're super heavy and you're like, oh, maybe I did water it a little too much. It's a lot easier to overlove our indoor plants than it is to underlove them. So for watering stuff, people usually like to stick to schedules. They usually ask me, how often am I going to water this? It's different for everywhere you put it in your house. You can take the same plant and move it to the other side of your house, and that watering schedule is going to change up just a little bit at least. A lot of it has to do with airflow. Things take longer to dry out in the summertime because we've got the AC blasting. They dry out a little faster in the winter sometime because the heaters are on. It has to do with how close it is to the window, how much light it's getting, how quickly it's photosynthesizing because of that additional light hitting it. So the easiest thing to do is really listen to the plants that you have and kind of figure out in the spot that you've put it, how often are you actually going to be watering it. Pick it up, feel the leaves, see how quick it takes it to kind of dehydrate enough that those firm leaves are starting to become soft, that when you pick it up, it doesn't really have any weight to it anymore. It feels very top heavy. That's when you're going to really want to water it. You want to let it dry out to the point that it's ready for a good drink. With almost everything. I mean, some things, if we're talking about the trickier stuff like the maidenhair ferns that really don't want to dry out all the way, that's kind of its own thing. But for most of your houseplants, you really want to wait until they've dried out thoroughly before giving them a really good drink. And when I say good drink, I mean, bringing it over to the sink, or if you have something with a saucer under it, making sure that the water runs all the way through and that it has weight to it afterwards. Sometimes you need to let it sit in that water for a little bit for it to really absorb back in, especially if it's something that's dried out for a long time. Like our snake plants and our ZZ plants like to be very dry. They only get watered about once a month. So sometimes, you'll have to let it sit there and absorb that water again, because the soil will become hydrophobic after that long. It'll just run right through it. It's not going to stick. You'll be like, what's happening? I just watered this. Why is it still dry? So it's always important to kind of listen to them, look to them, touch your plants, see how they're doing, be kind of involved with it until you kind of figure out how often it's really needing that drink. So watering wise, low water, medium water, frequently watered stuff is largely going to depend on the family of plant. And that's just kind of something you can think about when you're picking out plants. You can say, oh, okay, this is a peace lily. It's going to get watered pretty frequently. It'll flop over and be super dramatic, and then you'll give it a drink and it'll pop right back up. And it'll be a lot easier to gauge than this bird's nest fern here. It's not going to wilt down, but it's going to start to look blanched. It's going to get kind of grayish green instead of nice and lime green. And that's when it's going to need a really good drink. So they all kind of have their own way of telling you that they're thirsty, but it is important to let them actually dry out enough, just so that they're not going to end up with any root rot or issues later on from having been overwatered. So the last thing that I kind of put on your little handout for today, just as like things to look for in your home and think about when you're getting houseplants and think about what you need for houseplants, is the soil that you use. Almost all of these, certainly all of these on the table here would be totally fine with regular potting soil. The difference between the potting soil and the succulent mix is going to be the drainage. So if you have something that likes to dry out faster, maybe consider putting it in a succulent mix just so that it can drain faster if it needs to. And that'll kind of give you an additional buffer so that you don't have to worry about it staying wet too long, because you know that it's already going to be drying out faster because it has that drainage. Certainly, even with, the snake plant and the ZZ plant, again, that don't get watered very often, you can use regular soil with it because you're going to be very infrequent with your watering. But if you're someone that likes to give everything a little sip and you're going to be watering it more, giving it a more draining soil is just going to help it be as dry as it wants to be. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. So when you're purchasing potting soil, it's almost always fine to just use regular soil. And even on some stuff that would really prefer succulent mix, if you back off on your watering yourself, that will give it the same benefit as using a succulent mix. It's all about the drainage. It's all about how fast it's going to be drying out. So it's really just a buffer for you to use. All right, so I'm going to kind of go through the plants that I've pulled out today and just kind of tell you more about all of them. We just got these in, and I'm so excited. It's been a long time since we've had these. These are the Domino variegated peace lilies. Same care as your regular peace lilies. In general, is just kind of a little rule of thumb. Whenever something has less green on it, it's going to need a little bit brighter light. So the peace lilies, the regular ones, are known for being able to handle that super low light. I would say medium light on this one because it's got that white variegation to it. But very easygoing, very vocal about its needs. And honestly, very resilient. It can get mad at you quite a few times before it actually starts to do poorly. They really do well. I turned my radio down. Oops. So this bird's nest fern, this is the Osaka variety of bird's nest fern, which just kind of refers to its little frilly fingers on the end here. They come in a lot of different varieties, but all of them really have to do with the leaf shape on the end. So definitely one of the easiest ferns to do. It's not super picky on humidity. It's a lot lower water than a lot of the ferns are. It's not low water because it is still a fern. It's definitely in that medium water, which in general is weekly to every 2 weeks kind of a thing, I would say. But very easygoing. medium to bright light, and just a really lovely way to bring that fern, very foresty kind of aesthetic to your interior, even if you are bad with ferns. If you're bad about watering, if you forget it often, I mean, these guys are super easy. And in general with ferns, the thicker the leaf is, the more tolerant they are of lower water and lower humidity. So these guys, the staghorns to an extent, the kangaroo paw ferns, those ferns that have that broad leaf to them are going to be a lot more forgiving. This guy right here is an aglaonemia. These are also called Chinese evergreens, and these are fantastic for low light. When I first started getting into plants and working in the green industry, this was one of the first plants that I started noticing all over town. I mean, you see these in restaurants and retail spaces, in hospital lobbies where they switch out the plants all the time, but sometimes these will be huge, and that's really a testament to how well they do in different lighting. I mean, those LED lights will absolutely keep them going. They're very, very tolerant of low light, and with that, kind of hand in hand is usually low water. The lower light it's in, the slower it's going to be photosynthesizing, the lower the water needs will be because it won't be using it as fast. Really fantastic. They come in a super wide variety of colors. They come in pinks and reds and yellows and a bunch of different shades of green. This is the classic silver one, and they're just really fantastic. It's a great plant to kind of realize that you can do well with, and then you can kind of explore those different varietals and find some really fun stuff to do in your home without having to do so much work with it. So we just got this in as well. This is a little blush syngonium, and I went ahead and pulled them for this class. The syngoniums are very easy in general. Medium water and not super picky on their light. They can certainly do medium to low light. I would say, again, with the less green, brighter the better. But as you can see, the back side of this one is super green, and they will kind of move themselves around with the light. Just a really fun alternative, I think, to like your normal pothos ivy. If you have an area that you've done well with pothos in the past, these will absolutely do well. They also come in a bunch of different colors. I think this one's the most fun because it's pink. But, I mean, they come in lots of different greens. We have this one that's more of a dark reddy purple color. I think it looks a lot like deli meat, but it's also my favorite, and I have a bunch of them. So, really fun. So this and this guy right here are both different varietals of Dracaenas, and I pulled both of them because, as you can see, they look super different, and this Dracaena is one that we see a lot of, especially taller. That's the classic marginata, and both of these are going to be low light tolerant, low water, but this guy right here, the white jewel Dracaena, just a really great example of how once you find a plant family that you do well with, there's options within it. There's so many different colors of these. There's ones that are more twisted. There's ones that are all different colors, different thicknesses of the leaves. They're super easygoing, and it's so fun to be able to have super different colors and textures in your space without having to relearn a whole nother plant's needs and way that it communicates. So really great option always. This right here is, in my opinion, the absolute hardiest plant you can do inside. This is the ZZ plant. They do come in different colors. It can sometimes be kind of hard to find them, and there is also a miniature version of it that's more compact, but again, it's a little harder to find sometimes. We do have some of the larger Raven ones right now, which are this really gorgeous, rich, glossy black color, but so easygoing. I literally have one of these in a room with blackout curtains, and it just happens to be next to a fish tank, and it's good with that. The light from the fish tank isn't even pointed at it, it's just next to it. And that is enough. It does not care. They are so fantastic. They're so easygoing. And they're just really neat. They have, each of these is actually a singular leaf. These are compound leaves, and so they come up from the bottom and open up as one. It's not that the branch grows individual leaves off of it. So it's really neat to watch them get bigger. They are pretty slow growing, and the lower light you have it in, the slower it'll grow. Again, photosynthesis slows down all that stuff. But if you've never tried one of these before, they're so easy, and they're so low water. I mean, once a month, if that. Inside the house, I typically like to wait for them to get softer, a little more wrinkled. The leaves aren't hard, but they are firm. And certainly when they're not covered in water spots, they're very glossy, and they will kind of end up looking a little duller when it's time for it to have a good drink. You'll also find with these, they have really large roots. It almost looks like a potato. In a way, they have these nodes on the roots, these nodules on the roots that are really, really big. And that's why this pot is all misshapen. It's because he's pushing it with his big roots. So when you get one of these and you put it in its more permanent home container, a more decorative pot, maybe choose something that you don't mind having to break to get it out of. They really wedge themselves in there. And they like to be tight. They like to be really tight, which is why we haven't even thought about repotting these ones. He's loving this. He's, I mean, literally stretching the plastic out, and he's having a great time with it. And that also is a way that the plant is creating a natural buffer for its watering cycle. Because it has less soil, because it has less space for water to be in, it's drying out faster. So even though I water them on a pretty regular basis, they're out here where it's hot, and they don't have a ton of soil to hold that moisture on them. So it's going to dry out a lot faster. Let me see what else I got on the other side. I'll kind of come back around. So I grabbed two different ivy varietals. This one right here is the regular Marble Queen Pothos ivy. Pothos is known for being able to go into pretty low light situations. Not this one. This has a lot of white on it. And again, the less green something has on it, the brighter light it needs. Could definitely do medium light. Doesn't have to be bright light, but not the dark corner on this one. It won't enjoy it very much. But a beautiful varietal, and I mean, just a really great color to have in your space. There aren't very many things that have this much white on them, and very, very easygoing. This one right here is a type of heartleaf philodendron ivy, the philodendron cordatum. This color is called Brazil. It's got these nice stripes on it. I absolutely adore this plant. I think that these ivies, this family of ivies, is easier to do than the pothos in my opinion. They're a little bit lower water. They have a thicker leaf to them by a little bit, and they are so tolerant and hardy. They do not care what you do to them or where you put them, and they're just fantastic. So if you've only done pothos before, or if you've only tried to do English ivy in the house, which I think is a lot harder than most people say it is. I'm not the biggest fan of that one just because it's hard. But these are fantastic. Try branching out into the different cordatum. They come in lots of different colors. They're all this shape. Cordatum refers to this heartleaf shape. But they are fantastic. The Mikan is a really popular one. It has that red purple kind of color to it, a more velvety texture to the leaves. That one likes a little bit more humidity. They come in a solid green as well, but they're just very, very easygoing and tolerant, and a great thing to have in your space. So the last plant that I have pulled is this nice big snake plant. I grabbed one of the big ones because he's just gorgeous. This is the Laurentii coloration of them, which is just these yellow stripes on the edges. These come in way more varieties than most people know about. They come in the cylindrical ones where the leaves are almost not tube shaped because they don't have a hole to them, but they're like little spikes of leaf kind of a thing. They come in the starfish, which is fanned out of those spikes. They come in all different color variations of these ones. Some of them are thinner, some of them are shorter, some of them have a super wide leaf to them, and all of them are very tolerant of low light, and because of that, they are very low water. Again, the lower light you have it in, the lower water or the less water you're going to end up having to give it. And that's just kind of something you'll have to feel out for yourself based on where it is. I have them in the window where they get watered probably once a month. I have them across the room from the windows that already aren't that bright on the mantle, where I water them honestly maybe once a year. Like, they are low light and they're doing fine. They could be doing better if I put them somewhere brighter, but because they're in that low light, if I give them more than that, they're going to start crashing. So, really start learning how to read the plants you have. If they're getting wrinkled, if those leaves that are supposed to be very rigid are getting softer, it's ready for a drink. If they aren't, maybe wait. If you've put something in a low light corner that you think is going to do really well, and you're sure that you're doing well on the watering, but it's starting to pop yellow leaves, maybe move it somewhere brighter. It doesn't really like where it is. I've had that happen plenty of times, and sometimes I leave them there and just cut the leaves off and say, this is your spot. You're going to have to learn to do well in it. But, I mean, if you really care about the plant itself and want it to end up doing well, that's kind of an indicator that it's not doing great in that area. I also went ahead and pulled the houseplant fertilizers that we have. We just got these super cute ones from Fertilum. We have a succulent one and we have the all-purpose. The all-purpose is actually the same analysis as Osmocote. If you've ever used that in your garden, it's kind of the go-to granule all-purpose fertilizer. This is a nice 10-10-10. The succulent and cactus one, it is a little bit lower nitrogen and a little bit higher phosphorus. Now, nitrogen is that first number on the analysis. All of your fertilizers, they're always going to have those 3 little numbers on the back. NPK, it's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. I have no idea what the potassium does. No one's ever given me a firm answer. I could probably look it up, but it's an important nutrient for the plant to have so that they can continue to photosynthesize and intake things through their roots. But it doesn't have a nice catchy, this is what it does for your plant like the other two do. Nitrogen is dark, new growth. It's that rich, green, vibrant growth that you're trying to get on plants. Phosphorus is blooming. It very much encourages blooming, which is why the succulent and cactus one has so much of it. You want your plants to be able to have the nutrients they need to start blooming and producing for you. So different plants will have different fertilizers that they prefer, but almost all of your houseplants will be okay with an all-purpose. Not very many of them bloom. Not very many of them care. I use all-purpose most of the time at home. Kind of depends what I have on hand, but it is important to fertilize your houseplants. You don't want to have to repot them super often, but they will use up the nutrients that are already in that container, in that soil. So monthly at most, you could definitely do every other month. It's important to go through and give them a dose of fertilizer so they can continue to grow and produce healthy new growth for you. It's not that they're eating the fertilizer. That's kind of a common misconception. I hear people say that sometimes, that they need to eat. It's that it allows them to intake the water and photosynthesize correctly. So it's allowing them to eat, but it's not what they're eating kind of a thing, but it is really important. You'll see a huge difference if you've never fertilized your houseplants before and you give them a nice high dose of fertilizer. You will see the difference. It's pretty crazy, especially if your plants are starting to look kind of blanched out. They're not dry, they're in a good spot, but they're not super vibrant anymore. They just look kind of dull. They haven't been growing a lot lately. Give them some food. It will make a huge difference. At home, I usually use the different Fox Farm liquid foods. They're not, the ones that we have aren't specifically marketed towards houseplants, but there, again, are different all-purpose ones you can use through them. In the greenhouse, though, I pretty much strictly use this Good Dirt one. It is so nice. It is all-purpose. It doesn't smell bad, and it is good stuff. I mean, a couple days after I give everything a dose of this in there, it is looking so lush and beautiful. And I love the different, organic or mostly organic fertilizers, mostly because of the smell typically. But it's nice to have one that smells a little bit better I don't know. I'm definitely very familiar with different fish emulsions and things, and they're so good for ferns and stuff, and it's so satisfying to see how well they do after you give them some of that, but it is not fun to use, and I would not use it in my house. And so it's so nice to have something organic like that that is so good for them still, but doesn't smell bad, and I can just keep watering them inside with it. So I love the Good Dirt stuff. One of my very favorites. The potting soils I pulled for y'all, the succulent mix we have is by Fertilome. Again, the succulent mix just has more drainage to it, so it doesn't necessarily matter what brand you go with. Certainly, if you like to stick to your organic stuff, I don't think this one is labeled organic, but with most of your soils, unless they have some kind of added fertilizer, which this one doesn't, they're usually going to end up being organic. It's more so that they didn't get that certification. They can be kind of costly to get for a lot of stuff. But we do also have a lot of different varieties of potting soil. This one's by Good Dirt. I use this, I would say most often if I have to repot anything here, add some soil to something here, I'll use the Good Dirt stuff. I mean, it's a really nice potting soil. It's really nice and fluffy. We do also have the Fox Farms potting soils, which are what I always tell people, like, that's the good stuff. That's the really good stuff. It's a little bit higher price point, but that's the kind of stuff you open up the bag, and if you're a big plant person that's worked with all different stuff, you're like, oh, that's nice soil. That feels good. And the plants love it. I mean, we have the regular one that's just the organic potting soil, and then we have the Ocean Forest, which has slow release organic fertilizers already in it, so you can even back up off on your fertilizing routine a little bit once you repot them with some of that stuff. It is fantastic. And even though it's a regular potting soil, they actually, the Good Dirt brand as well as the Fox Farms ones, they drain really well, honestly. It's not something, I know typically with like the Miracle Grow soils and stuff, sometimes they clump up and it gets, into like a really dense ball around the plant, especially when it dries out. You'll end up with this hard disc of soil, and it's like, oh my gosh, how am I supposed to get water back into this now? Like, this is a mess. Or, you do get water back into it and it doesn't dry out for weeks. It just stays sopping wet. You don't really have to deal with that issue with these soils. I mean, they're just really nice, and the drainage has a lot to do with that. I think that's everything that I've pulled for you guys. That's just kind of my basic spiel on how to assess the conditions of your home and kind of figure out what will do right for you. Certainly there's a lot of other plant families that you can get into, but it really just depends. These are more so the starter ones. Yes?
How do you know when it's time to repot? Like, what are signs? Like, some of those
Yeah.
are like really full in their pots.
Yeah, definitely a lot of these could do with repotting. Repotting inside a greenhouse condition is always optional because it's so humid in here. It isn't as much of an issue for them to be restrained in their pots, and a lot of these tend to do better if they are tighter, so it does kind of depend on the plant family as far as how often they get repotted. But generally speaking, when it's not holding the water well, it's drying out a lot faster, you're starting to get yellow leaves, it's looking wilted, it's not, responding well to your care, that's kind of when it's time to think about repotting. And in general with repotting, you want to do no more than 2 inches on either side, so a total of 4 inches bump. You really don't want to go beyond that just to avoid shock. Usually I do less than that when I'm moving stuff, unless it's something really big. Now this piece lily here, he's really big for this container, and there's a lot of different plants in here. It's not just one spath. I mean, he's got little, plants all stuck in here. And if I pull him out, you can see the roots on the bottom, but they're not all the way up yet. So he's totally fine to be in here for, honestly, probably at least another 4 to 6 months. Now, if I took him home, I probably would put him in a bigger pot, definitely a deeper and heavier ceramic pot so that it doesn't, tip over just from it being so top heavy. But a lot of things, even if they are big for their container, it's important to just kind of check how the root ball's doing and see how much space it has left. Especially with the things that like to stay tighter, you kind of want to wait until it's filled up that container a little bit more.
But then when you repot them, do you tickle the roots like you do a shrub?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it kind of depends. I mean, some people want to repot their plants in kind of the least stressful way for the plant possible. I think it's really important to actually go through, knead the root ball, get most of the soil off of it, and assess the roots. Just take that opportunity to see how they're doing while you have it out of the container. Something really beneficial is trimming back the root ball, especially if it's something that has a really good sized root ball on it, but maybe the plant isn't very large, or you've just had a bunch of die off, you've had some kind of an issue with it, and you're trying to encourage it to come back. Giving the roots a little bit of a trim with very sharp scissors, they prefer that, and definitely making sure that all of the roots are nice white, yellow, lime green, healthy. If you have any brown or soft roots, it's very important to trim those off. And if you find that you have a lot of those roots that are kind of sloughing off, that have gotten some kind of a rot, you can actually dilute a little bit of hydrogen peroxide in a little spray bottle, like 1 part hydrogen peroxide, 4 parts water, very, very diluted, and spray down the root ball after you've done that trimming, and that will kind of prevent it from getting rot in the future and kind of clean up anything that might be left on there. So I really do like to go through and assess it. Not to say that I haven't been very lazy in the past and just, taking it out of the nursery pot, popped it in something, put a little more around the edges. But, in an ideal world, you'd go through and look at the roots a little more thoroughly. They do appreciate it. Any other questions? In the greenhouse, I usually also do monthly. At home, monthly to every other month. It just kind of depends. And I do like to wait until things are looking ready for a feed. Again, when they're starting to look more blanched out, but they've had enough water, that kind of a thing. You kind of want to wait, I would say, and see when they need it. You can definitely over-fertilize things. It's a lot easier with the liquids or the water-soluble, those like the old-fashioned Miracle Grow that comes in that tub and you just add it to the water. That kind of stuff is going to be an immediate feed as opposed to the granules, which take a long time to break down. Really more beneficial for outside. I don't like doing granules in the house just because typically they can't break down within the allotted time, and it just isn't as effective. So for houseplants, I would say monthly at most. Some things eat more than others. Definitely like the fiddle figs and stuff are going to be what we consider heavy eaters, so we feed those a little more often. It's just to keep that rich green coloration, and again, just kind of waiting to see when they start looking a little blanched out. Any other questions?
If you have a leaf that has like damage or it's brown or yellow, do you just use some scissors and cut it off?
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime you have any kind of a damaged leaf, it's just taking away energy from the plant. Yeah, absolutely. You gotta get brave with your scissors and be ready to take them off. I mean, a lot of the time, people will have plants where they're like, oh, it's looking so scraggly, so leggy at this point. I've taken the lower leaves off. It's looking, cut it back. It'll come out so much fuller. I've had so many house plants. Gosh, in the big freeze we had a couple of years ago, we didn't have power for like a week, and our house got cold, and I had a lot of plants freeze inside the house, and I had this really big Syngonium, one of these guys, one of the green ones, freeze all the way down in its indoor pot. And it's huge now. It completely came back. So don't ever be afraid to cut something back pretty severely. It will come out so much fuller and bushier. Take any damaged leaves off. It'll thank you for it by being able to put energy into new growth. So.
Okay, like that guy with the leaves that burned, looking
Yeah.
on the end. Is that from too little water?
Yeah, inconsistent watering. It's been a hot summer, and we've had this one for a while, so he's got these little tips. Now, the reason I haven't trimmed these back is with Dracaenas and with a lot of your houseplants, cutting them will not stop it from browning. If I trimmed all of these little tips off, it would just keep browning. But he's doing really well, and you can see all this new growth doesn't have that. So it's just kind of something in that plant family that will happen. Typically. It's really hard. Now, that almost always, I would say, is underwater. It's really important to either using a moisture meter, or if it's small enough that you can pick it up, really make sure that it's too little instead of too much, because after a certain point it'll look the same. That happens all the time with, I mean, even in the greenhouse, sometimes we'll be like, oh, you look dry, and then you'll pick it up and you're like, oh, you're not dry. You have been too wet, because once those roots start rotting, it's not able to take the water in. So it'll look super dry after a point, but it's because the roots are gone and it's been too wet.
Any other questions? You want to mention the kokodama?
Oh, yeah, next week we're not having a regular class. We are doing a workshop, and we're making these. We're making these staghorn kokodamas. They're so neat. They're so fun. It's a moss ball wrapped around the fern and secured with twine, and the staghorns absolutely love them. A lot of different fern varieties love them. You can do orchids this way. It's a really fun and useful skill, and it's an alternative to having another pot in your home. You can take, any dish that you have and just set it on that. I mean, the staghorns, medium to bright light, they are not super picky, and you just water it in the dish. That moss is able to absorb the water up through it. It's a very old Japanese technique of doing plants, and you can even, tie more twine to this and hang them up. They certainly don't have to be sitting, but yeah, we're building these next week. So sign up if you want to. Sign up on Facebook, and it'll be really fun. Yeah.
Thank you guys for coming.